All right, in order to do watercoloring, obviously you need brushes. So one thing I wanted to make sure that you are aware of and comfortable with is the Stampin'Up product that supports watercoloring. So we sell a set of what's called water painters. They come in a set of 3. And the idea of a water painter, if you're unfamiliar with this kind of product, is that it's got a barrel that's got water in it. You can see the water going back and forth horizontally when I shift the balance here. And then it's a pen. So if you look at it closely, it's got this word push printed on the side. And then it's printed again on the other side. And what you're supposed to do is to squeeze. So you can see me applying some pressure here. And what that does, every time you squeeze, is it puts a little bit of air into the barrel down here and just creates some pressure to make that water flow through the pen. And then what I do before I use it is I just test it on my hand until I can feel that the water is coming out. I don't know if you can see, but my hand is a little bit wet down there. And the way these things work, it's supposed to help you avoid the need to have a glass full of water on your desk that could potentially spill and knock into all of your stuff. So instead of dipping in water and then that water getting all murky and muddy, you would be able to dip this into paints and then clean it just by swishing it on a paper towel or a piece of scratch paper and then putting it into another container of paint. I have them laid out here. They come 3 in a package, and you can see that one is a wide brush, one is a nice full brush with a very nice pointy tip to it, and then one is a fine tip pen down here. All right, so paint brushes is one thing that you need for watercolor. So here's another product that Stampin'Up sells that's useful when you're doing watercoloring. This thing is a water spritzer. They come 2 in a pack. I think it's $3.50. It's very inexpensive. And then it squirts up this very fine mist. Okay. And this is useful when you want to get your paper wet ahead of time. It's also useful to spritz something afterwards if you need to add a little bit of extra water. And I sometimes just use this to spritz right into my my paint source to water down the paint. So our ink pads, again, what you should know about them is that you can squeeze the pad and then end up with, well, if you squeeze it hard enough, and then end up transferring ink from the ink pad to the inside surface of the lid. And this becomes your paint palette that you can pick up with the brushes. Sometimes this is a little more intense than I want, and I would use the spritzer to dilute that a little bit. And sometimes I'll simply add a drop of re-inker in here. And then, of course, it's very concentrated. And then I would use the spritzer to add a little bit of water to water it down, to dilute it down. All of our inks are water soluble. They work great for watercoloring. When you want to stamp the image, it makes a difference what you use to create the line art. So this is water soluble. StazOn ink is not water soluble. Therefore, you want to be stamping your image in StazOn. You do not want to stamp with Memento because the Memento ink will bleed. So Memento is the wrong one to use for watercoloring. StazOn is the right ink to use for watercolor. Alternatively, you could heat emboss. So like this one right here, I heat embossed in gold. You can emboss in any color. But the heat embossing is another way because the heat embossing won't bleed when you come back in watercolor. So you need the tool, you need the ink, and you also need the right kind of paper. So Stampin'Up sells a watercolor paper. It's called Fluid 100 watercolor paper. So can you color on our regular cardstock? Yes, you can watercolor on this. You just have to make sure you don't get it too wet, because if it gets too wet, it will pill up a little bit. And we do sell one other paper that's good for watercoloring. This is the Shimmery white cardstock. And it's nice for watercoloring because it's got a little bit of, it's hard to catch on the camera here, but it's got some reflective little bits of something in here, which makes it shimmery, but it also helps to add to that letting that ink sit around on the surface so that it can be moved a little bit before it sinks into the fibers. So I will very often use the shimmery white cardstock on a project. Now, one thing you will notice is that the shimmery white, I hope the colors are coming through here, the shimmery white is definitely not as white as our regular white. Let me put this out here. You see the, oh yeah, I think you can see the difference. So the shimmery white is a much more yellow tint to it. I mean, it's not really yellow. If I looked at it, if somebody said, look at that cardstock, I'd say, oh, that's white. But you set it next to our basic white and it's not as white. In addition to the paper, the tool, and the color coming from the ink, we also sell a watercolor pencil. Now, whatever they make this pencil from, it is water soluble, which means that you can color with it and it looks just fine, but you can also go over it with a tool like a paintbrush or our blender pens, and you can move that color around a little bit to smooth it out. We actually sell 2 sets of watercolor pencils. You'll see them in the catalog. So this is the color set that's included in watercolor set number 1, and watercolor set number 2 fills in with a little bit more. These are more brights, and then these are a little bit more neutrals and regals. One more tool to mention if you're doing this with customers. It is nice if you're working with water to work on something like the silicone craft mat, because this is non-porous and therefore it will protect your paper surface. All right, let's talk techniques for just a moment. So one technique is to simply color your image, because you've either stamped it in the stays on or you have heat embossed it. A second technique that's kind of fun to do with watercoloring is a background. A third technique, similar to the watercolor wash, would be to do an emboss resist. And a fourth technique that's kind of fun, especially with the watercolor pencils or with a stamped image, is to do what's called faux watercolor. So this is another color product that Stampin'Up carries, the soft pastels. If you're a person who likes to color, this might be another tool that you'd like to spend some time playing with. So there's not a whole set of guidelines for using these, but they are similar to the watercolor pencils in that you could color with the pencils alone, or the pencils are water activated. Same thing with these. You can color with these alone, or they are water activated. So I focused all my comments on watercoloring, the water brushes. You can use any paintbrush. These are just convenient and less messy. The inks that we carry that are activated by water. There's one other tool that's also useful when you're doing ink blending kind of things, and this is the blender pens. We sell them in a set of 3. I didn't pull these out and use them, but they're going to work very similar to this. It's just that this has water in it and this has a little bit of a blending solution already in it, but they're going to work very, very similar. So if you are playing around, if you are someone who likes to color yourself, and or if you are thinking of doing events for customers, for friends, there's a lot of toys to play with for July's watercolor month. Feel free to drop any questions in the comments, and we'll just start some threads going in our Incredible Crafty Crew Facebook group and share with each other our experiences working with watercolor.